I found out my parents weren't coming to my PhD graduation on a Tuesday afternoon via a text message from my mother that was 11 words long. "Dad, and I think the drive is too far. Congratulations, though, honey." 11 words for 5 years. 11 words for the dissertation that had taken me 3 years to write, for the funding I had fought for the mornings I had sat in my car in the university parking lot talking myself into going inside because the work was difficult and the isolation was real, and there were months when finishing felt genuinely impossible. 11 words. And then, 4 months later, my brother, who had completed a 2-year professional program at a school 40 minutes from their house, had his graduation ceremony. My parents drove there the morning before to stay overnight so they wouldn't be tired for the event. My mother bought a new dress, and my father asked me, without a trace of irony, if I would be willing to speak at the reception afterward. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was who else had been asked to speak that same day. Take a second right now and tell me where you're watching this from. Drop your city or your country in the comments below. And I want to know, have you ever worked for something for years, achieved something real and hard-won, and had the people who were supposed to be proudest of you treat it like it barely mattered? Because what happened at my brother's graduation ceremony is something I have replayed more times than I can count. And I am still deciding how I feel about all of it. My name is Alina. I am 34 years old, and I have a doctorate in computational linguistics from a research university that I will not name because the specific institution is less important than the specific experience. I currently work as a senior research scientist at a technology company, doing work that I find genuinely meaningful, and that pays me well enough that the financial precariousness of my graduate school years feels, finally, like a different life. I have a small apartment with good light and a lot of books and a cat named Octavia who has strong opinions about my work schedule. This is my life now, and I am grateful for it in the particular way you are grateful for things you built yourself, from materials that were not always easy to find. But I need to tell you about the before, because the graduation story doesn't make full sense without the before. I grew up the second of 3 children in a family that operated, without ever explicitly stating this, on a hierarchy of whose achievements were worth the most attention. My older brother, Thomas, was the athlete, talented, socially effortless, the kind of teenager who moved through the world with a natural ease that rooms organized themselves around. My younger brother, Patrick, was the charmer, funny, quick, beloved by every teacher he ever had in the uncomplicated way of people whose personalities make others feel good about themselves simply by proximity. And then there was me, Alina, the reader, the one who needed glasses at 7 and spent recesses in the library not because she had no friends, but because she genuinely preferred what was happening in the books to what was happening on the playground. My parents loved me. I have never doubted that in any essential sense. But love and attention are not the same thing, and the quality of attention a family offers is shaped by what it values, and what my family valued was legible achievement, the kind that came with a scoreboard or a social confirmation or a story that translated easily at the dinner table. Thomas's track times were posted on the refrigerator. Patrick's lead in the school musical was attended by every family member, including 2 sets of grandparents. My academic awards, the ones I won consistently from middle school through high school, were acknowledged with warmth and filed away, the way you file away something you're pleased about but don't quite know what to do with. My father is an electrician, a good one, skilled and proud of his trade in a way I have always respected. My mother manages the front office of a dental practice. They are working people who built a stable life through consistent effort and have passed that work ethic to all 3 of their children, which is a genuine gift. But they have also, throughout my life, been most comfortable with achievement they could see and hold and explain quickly. Thomas's athletic accomplishments were visible and scorable. Patrick's performances were an event, a show, something you attended and applauded. My work, the reading, the writing, the thinking, the slow and mostly invisible accumulation of understanding, did not fit that template easily, and I spent a significant portion of my childhood trying to translate what I was doing into a language my family could receive. I was not always successful at this translation. When I told my parents I wanted to get a PhD, I was 23 years old and had just finished my undergraduate degree with the highest honors my department offered. My father's first question was what I was going to do with it. My mother's first question was how long it would take. When I said 5 to 6 years, depending on research progress, there was a silence at the dinner table that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. My father said, "That's a long time to be in school, Elena." My mother said, "What does a person do with a doctorate in linguistics exactly?" And I explained, patiently, thoroughly, with examples, and they nodded and they said they were proud of me, and I could see that they meant it. And I could also see that they had no real framework for what I was describing, and that the absence of that framework was going to matter. Graduate school was 5 years of the most demanding and most rewarding work I have ever done. I will not pretend it was easy or that the difficulty was glamorous. There were stretches of genuine hardship, financial, emotional, intellectual. There were months when the dissertation felt like a wall I could not find a door in. There were colleagues who left the program and colleagues who stayed, and the difference between them was not always ability, but was sometimes just the particular kind of stubbornness that keeps you in a chair when leaving would be more comfortable. I called my parents every Sunday. My mother asked about my social life with a consistency that suggested she believed loneliness was my primary graduate school experience. My father asked, periodically, whether I had thought about what I was going to do afterward, in the tone of someone who remained unconvinced that the thing I was currently doing had a logical destination. I updated them on my research milestones, the qualifying exams I passed, the conference papers I presented, the dissertation proposal that was approved, and they responded with affection that was genuine and engagement that was limited. And I learned to manage the gap between those two things by simply wanting less from those conversations than I had initially wanted. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the accumulation of small moments over 5 years that I absorbed and did not name. My mother spending 20 minutes on the phone describing Patrick's promotion at the marketing firm he worked for in detail, while I had just told her I'd had a paper accepted at the most competitive conference in my field, and she had said, "Oh, that's wonderful," and moved on. My father driving 3 hours to see Thomas in a regional tennis tournament, but not attending the research symposium I'd specifically told him about, which was 40 minutes from their house. These were small things. None of them was unforgivable individually, but they accumulated the way water accumulates in a basement, slowly, and then all at once. When I passed my dissertation defense, I was 30 years old. I sat in a small conference room with my committee, and I answered their questions for 2 hours, and when they sent me out to the hallway and called me back in and shook my hands and called me Dr. Vazik, I felt something so large and so complete that I stood in the hallway afterward and simply breathed for a while, not from sadness, but from the full weight of what had just become real. I called my parents from the parking lot. My mother said she was so proud. My father said congratulations and asked what the next steps were. The call lasted 6 minutes. The graduation ceremony was scheduled for the following May. I had submitted my information, ordered my regalia, received my seat assignment. I told my parents the date 4 months in advance. I told them again 2 months in advance. I followed up a month before, and my mother said they were planning on coming. I believed her, because graduation is the kind of event you simply do not miss for your child. It is one of the unambiguous ones, the occasions that exist outside the debate about what counts as worth showing up for, or so I had believed. The text came 11 days before the ceremony. 11 words, too far to drive. Congratulations, though, honey. I sat with my phone in my hand in my apartment for a long time after I read it. Octavia jumped onto the couch beside me and put her head on my knee, and I scratched behind her ears, and I looked at those 11 words for long enough that they stopped looking like language and started looking like shapes. And I thought about the 5 years. And I thought about my father's question, "What are you going to do with it?" And I thought about my mother's follow-up phone calls that lingered on Patrick's work events and Thomas's athletic accomplishments and moved quickly past my milestones. And I thought about the distance from my university to my parents' house, which I had driven myself at least 20 times, and which took 3 hours and 15 minutes on a clear day. I did not respond to. The text that night. I went to bed and I lay in the dark, and I had the kind of long, honest internal conversation with myself that you can only have when the circumstances have removed all the polite insulation. I thought about what it meant that they were not coming. Not just the fact of it, but the meaning of it. The message embedded in those 11 words about what my achievement was worth in the economy of my family's attention. And I decided something. Not dramatically, I did not throw anything or call them in anger. I simply decided, quietly and completely, that I was done translating, that I had spent 11 years turning my work into a form my family could receive, and I was finished with that project. They could find their own way to understanding what I had done, or not. But I was not going to keep explaining myself into a form that was easier for them to process. I went to my graduation alone. Not in the sad sense, my advisor was there, colleagues I genuinely cared about were there. My closest friend from the program flew in from across the country because that is who she is. I sat in my regalia in the late May sunshine, and I watched other graduates receive their hoods surrounded by large cheering families, and I felt honestly, cleanly proud. Of myself, by myself, for myself. It was a new kind of pride. Less complicated than the kind that requires witnesses. What happened 4 months later was something I had not planned and had not sought, and which arrived with the particular timing that life occasionally deploys when it is making a point. Patrick's graduation from his professional certification program was in September. The program was well regarded, the achievement was real, and I was genuinely happy for him. I want to be clear about that because my feelings about my brother are not the same as my feelings about the pattern his graduation was embedded in. My parents had been planning for Patrick's ceremony for weeks. My mother had found a new dress. My father had booked a hotel the night before so they would be rested. They had made dinner reservations for afterward at a restaurant Patrick liked. It was an event in the fullest sense, organized, celebrated, prepared for. My father called me 3 weeks before the ceremony. He was warm and chatty in the way he gets when he wants something and is building toward it carefully. We talked about the weather and my job for a few minutes, and then he said, "The program at Patrick's school is having a reception after the main ceremony. There's going to be a keynote speaker, apparently, and then some remarks from family members. Patrick wanted to know if you'd be willing to say something. You're good with words." He said this last sentence as though it had just occurred to him, as though it were an incidental observation, rather than the closest thing to an acknowledgement of my doctorate that he had offered in 4 months. I was quiet for a moment. "Who's the keynote speaker?" I asked. "Someone from the industry, I think. I don't know the details. Does it matter?" "It might," I said. "Let me think about it and call you back." I called Patrick directly. He was enthusiastic and slightly oblivious in the way of younger siblings who do not always fully track the undercurrents around them. He told me the reception format, the timeline, what he was hoping for. And then he mentioned the keynote speaker's name. I knew that name. I knew it because Dr. Carolyn Marsh was one of the most prominent applied linguists working in industry at that moment, because she had cited my dissertation research in a paper she had published the previous year, and because we had corresponded briefly by email after that citation, and she had said, in those emails, that she found my work genuinely significant. I knew her name because she was, in the professional world that my family had spent 5 years failing to understand, someone whose presence in a room I would have been navigating toward. I did not tell Patrick any of this. I said I would be honored to speak, and I would be there. And I spent the following 2 weeks preparing remarks that were warm and genuine about my brother, and also, because I am who I am, precise and considered and very good. The morning of the ceremony, I arrived at the venue early. I had not coordinated arrival with my parents, and I was already seated and speaking with the event organizer when they came in, my mother in her new dress, my father looking pleased in the way he looked when he had successfully organized something. They saw me and came over, and my mother hugged me and my father clapped my shoulder, and the interaction was warm and entirely normal, which was its own kind of strange, given that I was still carrying the 11-word text. The keynote address was scheduled before the family remarks. Dr. Carolyn Marsh walked to the podium, a composed, precise woman in her late 50s who carried herself with the authority of someone entirely at home in front of an audience, and she gave a talk about the intersection of language technology and human communication that was sharp and substantive, and exactly as good as her published work suggested it would be. And then, approximately 8 minutes into her remarks, she said something that shifted the atmosphere in the room in a way that I felt before I fully processed it. She said, "I want to talk about a piece of research that I think represents exactly the kind of thinking this field needs more of." She paused. Those of you who work in language technology may have encountered the name Alina Vazic. Her doctoral dissertation, published last year, proposed a framework for contextual semantic modeling that has genuine implications for how we build systems that understand human language at the nuance level. She looked up from her notes and out at the audience. Dr. Vazic's work is the kind of contribution that doesn't always get the recognition it deserves immediately, because it's ahead of the conversations currently happening in most rooms. But those conversations are catching up. The room was quiet in the attentive way rooms get when something unexpected has just been said. I was looking at my hands on the table in front of me. I could feel, without looking, my father turning to look at me. I could feel my mother doing the same. I kept my eyes on my hands for a moment longer, and then I looked up, and I met Dr. Marsh's eyes across the room, and she gave a small nod that was professional and precise and contained, I thought, a quality of recognition that had nothing to do with performance. After her address, during the transition before the family remarks, my mother leaned close to me and said, in a low voice, "Was she talking about you?" "Yes," I said. My mother looked at me for a long moment. "Your dissertation?" "Yes." She sat back in her chair. I watched something move through her face, not a simple emotion, not a clean one, but something complicated and real. Something that looked like the beginning of an understanding arriving later than it should have, but arriving nonetheless. My father said nothing immediately. He looked at the program in his hands. Then he said quietly, "Alina," just my name. And the way he said it, not as a question, not as a preamble, just as a word that was carrying more than it could hold, told me something had shifted in him too. I gave my remarks for Patrick. They were good. Patrick hugged me afterward with the full physical conviction of a younger brother who has just been publicly celebrated and is genuinely grateful, and I hugged him back and meant it completely. None of what had happened was his fault or his doing, and my love for my brother has never been contingent on the patterns surrounding him. Dr. Marsh found me during the reception. We spoke for 20 minutes about her citation of my work, about the directions I was taking the research in my current position, about a collaborative possibility she mentioned carefully and without pressure. My parents watched this conversation from across the room. I did not look over at them while it was happening. But I was aware of being watched, and there was something in that awareness, not triumphant, not vindictive, just very clear, that felt like the closing of a very long parenthesis. Afterward, in the parking lot, my father waited until Patrick had gone ahead to the restaurant, and then he stopped walking and turned to look at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not my father's usual composed, forward-moving face. Something older and more uncertain. He said, "I owe you an apology." I looked at him. "For which part?" He absorbed that. "For not coming," he said. "For not understanding. For a lot of it, Alina, I think for a lot of it." "I know you didn't understand what I was doing," I said. "What I needed was for that not to stop you from showing up." He nodded slowly. My mother had come to stand beside him, and she reached out and took my hand, and the three of us stood in a parking lot in the September afternoon with the weight of many years between us and the beginning of a different conversation, which is not the same as resolution, but is the necessary condition for it. We are still in that conversation. It has been 2 years and it is not finished, and I do not know if it will be finished in the way that stories finish in the versions we tell ourselves when we want things to be clean. What I know is that my father calls me now on Sunday mornings and asks about my work with a quality of attention that is different, not perfectly informed, not always arriving at the right questions, but genuinely trying. My mother asked me, last spring, to explain my research to her from the beginning, as if she were a person encountering it for the first time who wanted to actually understand it. That conversation lasted 2 hours, and she listened for most of them. I went to my graduation alone. I sat in. My regalia in the sunshine, and I was proud by myself. And that pride, that specific, solitary, entirely self-generated pride, is something I have never needed to revise. It belongs to me in a way that doesn't require witnesses to be real. But I am also glad for the parking lot. I am glad for the conversation that started there and the conversations that have followed. I am glad that it became possible, even if it required a keynote address from someone who cited my dissertation to make it possible. I would have preferred that my family had found their way to seeing me without that intervention. But I have made my peace with the path that actually happened rather than grieving the path that should have. Dr. Marsh and I are collaborating on a paper. It will be published next spring. I am going to make sure my parents know about it, not to prove anything, not to arrange another parking lot moment. Just because it is my work and it matters, and they are my parents and I am, still and finally, unwilling to stop believing that those two things can coexist. The work is the thing. It was always the thing, and no one's failure to show up for it has ever made it less true. If this story touched something in you, if you have ever achieved something real that the people closest to you couldn't quite see, leave me a comment. Tell me your story. And if you believe that what we build in the quiet, what we earn through the unglamorous and largely invisible work of years, is worth celebrating with or without a witness, hit the like button and subscribe. I'll be here every week with more stories, real and honest and completely human. I'm glad you were here for this one.